When we want to know how valid an argument is, we measure the validity using something called the Continuum of Certainty. In the Continuum of Certainty, it looks like a straight line. At one end, we are 0% sure. We have no idea. But as we move up this line, we would become 100% sure, if that's really possible. And all along here, maybe 10% sure, 20, 30, 40, even 50% sure, 60, 70, 80, 90. And as we move up, we become more and more sure of something. Now, how sure do we have to be before we make an action and make a decision? Well, that's measured on another line. It's called the threshold. The threshold is where an argument is sure enough, where we are sure enough of an argument to accept the conclusion. And there's several things about threshold. It may be different for different people. Your threshold might change on the same subject over a given period of time. Let's try an example of this. Let's say, for example, you're thinking about getting a TiVo. And you think you might like a TiVo, but it costs money. So your threshold to get one is up here. You have to be almost 70% sure before you get a TiVo. So, where are you now? You're down here. Let's say, well, I missed some shows, I'd kind of like to get it. I'm almost 20% sure that it's a good thing. One of your friends tells you that he loves it, always watches the best shows. Let's say, you get a change in your job, you got to work late, you're going to miss some shows you like. Well, now, you're even more sure you would like it. Come back, TiVo. Now let's say, though, that there's a big special on TiVos, and suddenly they're going to give it to you free, you just have to pay the monthly charge. That convinces you enough. And when you reach that spot, then it's valid enough, it's reached your threshold, you make the decision, you buy the TiVo. Now, here's another one that you might have tried, because it demonstrates something that thresholds change. Let's say you're going to a club. You get there about 10 o'clock and you're looking for romance. For you to find the right person, you have to be 75% sure that it's going to be a good thing. 10 o'clock. You've rejected several people because they just weren't valid enough to reach your threshold. But then, all of a sudden, it's now 11 o'clock. It's 12 o'clock. No one has paid any attention to you. Your standards get a little lower. And I used to be a bartender, I know from what I speak. So now, your thresholds are getting lower. Now it doesn't take as much to reach them. It's 1 o'clock. Thresholds even become lower. And as the night wears on, the thresholds get lower and lower till finally, it doesn't take much to reach your threshold. Sad, but this is where romance begins. Or is it romance? I don't know. You tell me. So let's try this whole thing again. Let's take a look at a couple of quick things. Here's your continuum of certainty. 0% valid all the way up to 100% valid. In fact, both science and law operate on this. How guilty does someone have to be before we convict them? Beyond a reasonable doubt. Reasonable doubt. We don't have to be absolutely sure that someone's guilty, but if the prosecution can show that it was beyond a reasonable doubt, then we find them guilty. Science is the same thing. Science never proves anything absolute. Science, if you've ever taken statistics, goes within a certain percentage of being accurate, and that's how valid it has to be to convince someone of that proposition. Now, let's say you can't do reasonable doubt. That's a criminal case, but you decide to sue them in a civil case. That's much less. That's 51%. This is the people's court. This is Judge Judy. All you have to do is show that you're more reasonable than the other side. 51%. But remember, is it true? We don't know, because this has nothing to do with truth. It measures validity. and just shows us when if it gets valid enough, it reaches our threshold, then we're willing to accept it. The continuum of certainty measures how sure we are of something. The higher up the continuum, the more certain we are of something. And when it reaches our threshold, we're willing to accept it. So remember, the critical thinker doesn't look for truth as much as they look for how valid an argument is, and is it the most valid argument available, or is that argument valid enough to reach our threshold? 0%? 100%. Is that argument valid enough to reach our threshold? And we will be studying during the semester what makes an argument valid, what makes the information we get reasonable enough for us to accept it, and talk about what other people try to do to challenge our critical thinking. But remember, important thing, we never reach 100%. We may get 99%, 99.9%. You know, sometimes on those Maury Povich type shows where they check the DNA to see if some man's the father of the child. It's never 100%. There's always a tiny room of doubt. And that's what critical thinkers can do. They are willing to doubt. They're willing to challenge their deepest held beliefs. They're willing to actually change their mind if a more valid argument comes along. And that's the sort of thing we'll be studying about during the semester. So remember, continuum of certainty measures validity. Threshold is that spot on the scale where you accept that argument.